Hello everybody, my name is Dean Haystack, and over the last while I've done an examination of the event of COVID, which I've titled Incidents, Accidents and Malevolence, an Idiocy Theory. Today we're going to cover chapter 1, or aspects of chapter 1 from the examination which I've done, and I've titled it The Dinosaur Bones in the Ground. In order to form a theory, you first need to have a priori facts which have been discovered. Like the first dinosaur bones discovered in the ground. Before they were discovered, there was nothing to base even a theory on or a hypothesis. Once you've discovered them, you say, well, what are they? Where are they from? How did they get here? When did they die? How many more are there? Etc., etc. And then you form a hypothesis in order to go in a direction and find evidence to eventually maybe even create a theory. There's a lot of discussion about conspiracy theories. I want to have a look at this from the point of view of idiocy theory and not necessarily conspiracy. So what's the a priori fact or facts to consider when forming a hypothesis? Before we look at what those a priori facts are, let me read chapter 1. The event of COVID, I believe it's accurate to claim, is or was the end of the world as we knew it. Events occurred so quickly and abruptly. Discomfort in the extreme, the acceptance of massive changes. No one would have dared consider prior to the event, and many changes we are now have adopted as normal or the new normal, declared openly and deliberately right from the beginning. A narrative of action, acceptance and compliance, although immensely uncomfortable, largely accepted, sometimes coerced. The new normal dictated and determined on our behalf amid uncertainty, fluidity and crisis, literally at high speed over blind horizons. In the previous chapter, if you remember my introduction, I spoke about how a white line is what keeps us safe on a road when we are traveling at high speeds. One car in one direction, another car in the other. It's the rule of a white line, that not even solid barrier that keeps us safe, yet lines needed to be crossed. What was evident is that we did cross those lines at high speed and over blind horizons, which is quite risky. Discomfort is the change agent. We don't change unless the alternative of remaining the same is more uncomfortable than the change that we need to embrace or adopt. Discomfort moves us. In the greatest crisis lies the greatest opportunity, and after all, necessity is the mother of invention. We had crisis and discomfort, and a new normal was declared. Was the new normal dictated, or did we manage to discover a new normal for ourselves? In March 2020, when lockdown began in my country, within days of one of the major financial players in the country, a billionaire magnate of international accreditation, Johan Rupert, was quoted in a businesslive.co.za article saying, "This is not just a pause in our economy, it's an entire reset of our economic system." And I've attached the link to that in the writings. Our announcement for lockdown came in late March 2020, at a time when there were fewer than 500 reported cases in the country and no one had yet been hospitalized. The reason for the lockdown was to curb or flatten the curve and curb the spread of the virus, to allow medical services time to prepare. Lockdown was to be for 21 days or 3 weeks. I've got a link giving those exact dates there as well. At the time, never mind the discussion regarding whether to lock down or not. That's a separate issue. I felt that the reason provided for lockdown was the wrong reason, as medical services had more than 3 weeks from all accounts, probably double that at least, to prepare. And if there was no good reason to lock down, I felt that there would be no good reason to unlock. The next day, on March the 23rd, which was a Monday in 2020, the announcement came on the Sunday night, and we needed to have locked down by the Thursday. I didn't bother waiting. I called the landlord for my mom's business where I was assisting after her stroke in the previous October, and told them I'm not paying another cent until we open again. And when we open, I'm not backdating. To either suspend the lease or put locks on the doors. Their initial response to me was, but we're going to be open in 3 weeks. I said, if that's the case, if you really believe that, then what I'm asking will not be a problem. They didn't accept my proposal, so I immediately notified the staff to close and lock the doors, and that it was likely that we wouldn't reopen, and that they should apply for whatever assistance they could get. I'm grateful that I made that decision, because with no good reason to lock down, believing there was no good reason to unlock, my suspicions were correct, because lockdown, as we know, went on for much, much, much longer. My mom lost her business and her income overnight. She was 72 at the time. Had I not made that decision, she would have lost even more, because the bills unpaid with no income to pay them would have piled up and made things much, much worse. As it turns out, the first major wave of infection hit about 24 weeks later, not 21 days. There is a link there to substantiate that as well. Johann Rupert's quote, or was quoted with the reset statement, before it was officially known that the lockdown wouldn't end after 3 weeks, and which eventually continued at various levels until April 2022, 750 days, almost 2 years later. Was Mr. Rupert making the claim that a 21-day lockdown was not a pause in the economy, but a reset of the economic system? Or did he know the lockdown was going to be much, much longer? That's a question mark, not a statement. At about the same time of Mr. Rupert's statement, a video went viral of President Ramaphosa of South Africa saying, and then laughing, lockdown ends in April, but I didn't say which year. He made that remark in 2020 during the period of the initial 21-day lockdown. The lockdown was officially declared over 2 years after it began in April 2022. The link to that clip is there as well. I'm not making claims as I make these as I reveal these realities. I'm stating aspects of what occurred at the time, and I acknowledge that the occurrences could be coincidence and incidental. Proving an intent isn't possible. I'm also demonstrating that, back to my analogy in the introduction, that we weren't just playing catch. The ball hitting me in the face was really unexpected. The information as far as a response to the virus hasn't been clear or concise, but vague, confusing and at times incoherent. Clearly, there's been reason to be concerned and alert even in March 2020. It's no surprise so many are dubious, doubtful, scared, and even angry. So much is unknown, and I'm trying to make sense of what's happened, and I invite you along for the ride. The beginning of the lockdown was like watching a magic act. Distraction, focused attention in one area, and then surprises just pop up unexpectedly everywhere else. Non-stop horrific news on every medium of communication, and literally nothing else to report for at least 6 months. With predetermined actions dished out which we had to adhere to. Freedoms and liberties disappearing like coins and trinkets while we wait for the dazzling finale, the big finish, save lives. To refer to the last 3 years as the COVID pandemic is inadequate and insufficient by a long margin. It's more accurate to refer to it, in my view, as the event of COVID, because there are two elements of suffering and not just one. It wasn't just a virus. The effects of the second will be with us for years after the virus has gone or is gone as a major threat. Yes, there was a virus, but a major aspect of the event of COVID was the response to the virus and not the pandemic itself. Keep in mind that the virus didn't impose measures. The authorities did. The virus didn't damage the socio-economic and political landscape. The measures imposed did. They are two separate issues. That message has been skewed from the very first day. I'd be remiss not to point out that the event of COVID is the first truly global event in human history, unless you are inclined to consider Noah's flood. I'll most likely get hammered for reporting this, but there were certain areas of the planet that didn't really suffer the virus in any real significant way, such as the South Pacific or Oceania, That's also leading all the way through to Australia and New Zealand. The continent of Africa mostly combined, suffering about 281,000 deaths out of the global 6.7 million which were recorded. That's about 4.2% of the world casualties out of a population of 1.27 billion people. In that area, there's 1.27 billion people. Yet there were only 4.2% of the world's casualties. That's hardly a pandemic for them. I've attached the link on the Worldometer for you to see those numbers. Yet the coordinated and imposed measures, or the response, the protocol, certainly affected everyone in every region of every country on every continent globally, and that's never occurred previously in our existence. Worth mentioning because there really is no record of anything else in human history that has been global to the extent of the event of COVID, or the event of COVID-19. We should be aware of what is called Event 201. I attached the link for you as well. The Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, in partnership with the World Economic Forum and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, hosted Event 201, a high-level pandemic exercise, on October the 18th, 2019 in New York. The exercise illustrated areas where public-private partnerships will be necessary during the response to a severe pandemic to diminish a large-scale economic and societal consequences, which is a direct quote from the website. That Event 201 was done literally months, if not days, before the virus broke out in Wuhan, China. Based on that exercise, the World Health Organization coordinated the global response when the news of the virus was later declared an emergency. It was a planned response, and it was coordinated. That's not theoretical. That doesn't mean it was sinister. In fact, with the technology and resources available in the 21st century, it would be irresponsible to not try and be prepared. I'm especially and specifically not forming a conspiracy theory in this examination. It's probably more reasonable to attribute what we are suffering or have suffered to incidents or perhaps accidents rather than malevolence or conspirators. So I'll call it a hypothesis of incidents and or idiocy, and not a theory of intent or malevolence, which people call a conspiracy theory. Before we can form a hypothesis, we first need a priori facts, like the first dinosaur bones in the ground. Only once finding the bones could questions be asked. What are they? What is it? Where did they come from? How did it get there? When? Are there more? How did it die? Once there is a hypothesis, evidence is sought to form a theory until enough evidence is found to make a theory credible and reasonable. So what are the dinosaur bones in the ground when it comes to the event of COVID-19? Fact 1. Something, a virus, is infecting everyone, making some people sick. Some of those are needing hospitalization and some of those people are dying. That's a fact. Fact 2, citizens around the world are losing their lives, livelihoods, and freedoms, their ability to make decisions for their future, to continue to self-determine, and governments and authorities around the world are taking more control. So the question is that purely all incidental? Over the last 3 years, the situation has been both fluid, yet at the same time very rigid. Fluid in that in the beginning, the threat of the virus wasn't fully known. How contagious was it? How dangerous? What are the symptoms? How best to treat infection? What works? What doesn't work? In curbing the spread even, treating the symptoms, infection rates, hospitalizations, deaths, etc. Much of the situation was changing at times, even daily, and the status and understanding today is vastly different from when it began. From what we apparently knew at the time, it was forecast to be 10 times more deadly than the flu. There's a link making that claim, or where that claim was made. But at the same time, things weren't just fluid, they were also rigid. Rigid in that there has been a one-dimensional approach and narrative to the pandemic, even though it's multivariable as a situation. It was stated that the response to the virus needed to be appropriate to the threat of the virus and the damage being caused to the social and economic environment. Yet nearly all the measures and protocols focused on stopping the virus from spreading increased the dimensions of carnage, all the while the actual danger of the virus wasn't adequately determined. So the danger of the virus being fluid, the measures remained rigid, which was counterintuitive and even incoherent. Speculative dangers of a novel virus with predetermined and rigid protocols and measures in response. I would say that's perhaps the first evidence of the idiocy to support the theory. Let's be clear, a virus is what a virus does. A virus doesn't lock down populations. A virus doesn't close borders, businesses and trade, disrupt supply chain of goods and services, create unemployment or increase poverty. A virus doesn't take away freedoms and the ability to self-determine. A virus spreads. It infects. It makes some people sick. Some of the sick go for care, and some of the sick even die. Measures and protocols do the rest. The pandemic is one element. The protocols are an entirely separate dilemma. We couldn't predetermine the outcomes of the pandemic. We knew too little. But the consequences of the protocols were predictable. If not predictable to the decision makers, then I say that may be more evidence to my hypothesis of your idiocy, yet far from conclusive, it must be said. Something needed to be done. Let's not kid ourselves. Over the next few chapters, we'll evaluate what has occurred and some of what was done. There is the substance to my theory of idiocy, or an idiocy theory.